Julius Caesar was undoubtedly a man of greatness and of tremendous military skills and political cunning, but he was also, in some instances, a man of mercy. He spared many of his political opponents in Rome after having defeated them at the Battle of Pharsalus. But among those whom Caesar spared was one who is counted among the most notorious traitors and backstabbers in all of human history, a man named Marcus Junius Brutus. He was born in 85 BC into a powerful family of Roman aristocrats, and Brutus counted among his relatives many influential politicians and distinguished generals. Yet Brutus' early life was marked by tragedy and the horrors of civil war. His father, who was also named Marcus Junius Brutus, was killed by the brilliant commander Pompey after the siege of Mutina, which left Brutus fatherless at only 8 years old. He grew up and proceeded to have a career in politics. He assisted the governor of Cyprus in 58 BC, was responsible for the Roman minting of coins in 54 BC, and became a senator in 53. Brutus was naturally opposed to Pompey, who to Brutus' great dismay went from triumph to triumph and grew increasingly strong. After Pompey had defeated Iberian rebels in the west, conquered Syria in the east, and cleansed the entire Mediterranean Sea of pirates, many felt that he was powerful enough to take over the Roman state, and that he was a serious threat to the Roman Republic. Brutus was one of Pompey's fiercest enemies in the Senate, as far as harsh words are concerned, but he could realistically do little more than to publicly criticize Pompey. That is, until 49 BC, when Brutus finally got the chance to do some serious damage to his father's murderer. A civil war had broken out between Pompey and Julius Caesar, and many senators now felt that Caesar, rather than Pompey, was the one with too much power, and that he was the real threat to the Republic. For this reason, many of Brutus' closest friends and political allies, such as Cicero and Cato the Younger, had joined with Pompey. Brutus was, on the other hand, considered a dear friend by Julius Caesar, who years earlier had offered to take Brutus with him to his glorious conquest of today's France and Belgium. And this, of course, was Brutus' one chance at avenging his murdered father. Well, for some reason, Brutus still decided to take Pompey's side against Caesar. Maybe because Brutus saw Caesar as a potential tyrant. Maybe because most of his friends and colleagues were in Pompey's camp. Or maybe because Brutus' relationship with Caesar had been complicated by the fact that Caesar for many years had had a love affair with Servilia, Brutus' mother, who apparently was madly in love with Caesar. Brutus, in any case, traveled east to Greece, where Pompey and his allies assembled an army of at least 50,000 men. Pompey won against Caesar at Dyrrhachium, but suffered a critical defeat at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC. Brutus, along with many others, was now forced to surrender to Caesar, with no guarantee to avoid humiliation, torture, and an excruciatingly painful death. But all of Brutus' fears, as it turns out, were completely in vain, because Caesar showed himself extremely merciful to the fellow countrymen and colleagues that had surrendered to him. Caesar did not only let Brutus keep his life, but also his dignity, his property, his titles, and his high standing in Roman society. And this was the case with Cicero and the others who surrendered as well. Caesar forgave all those who came to him asking for mercy. Caesar held triumphs and celebrations after the civil war had ended, and there was no real opposition to him among the common populace of Rome. Caesar wanted his leadership to be defined by unity, clemency, and an attempt to heal the wounds which the Republic had incurred not only during the recent civil war, but during many decades of blood-soaked internal conflicts. There were, however, those who had an extremely malicious and poisonous view of Caesar's attempt at reconciliation. They called themselves liberatores, or liberators, since they saw Caesar as a tyrant, and themselves as defenders of the Republic. And chief among them was Brutus, who had decided that acts of mercy, friendship, loyalty, and love were a lot less than the ideals of republicanism. He quietly conspired with Cassius Rondinus, who was his brother-in-law, and with Decimus Brutus, who was his distant cousin, and the so-called liberators grew to include at least 60 Roman senators. The conspirators decided on March 15. This was the date when Julius Caesar, the tyrant, should be removed from all his public offices and responsibilities. On that fateful day, Caesar went to the Senate house, expecting to congregate with esteemed colleagues and beloved friends of old. Everything seemed to be going well, and order seemed to finally have been restored in the Republic. But when Caesar was unexpectedly crowded by the senators, and Lucius Cimber, out of nowhere, proceeded to pull down Caesar's toga, Caesar knew that something was horribly wrong. One after another, the senators produced knives, with which they stabbed Caesar from all directions. Publius Casca first stabbed Caesar in his neck, then Gaius Casca in his side, and then Cassius Longinus in his face. Caesar was stabbed 23 times in total, and it is said that the dying Caesar was absolutely heartbroken to see Marcus Junius Brutus among his murderers. So, in 44 BC, died the conqueror of Gaul, and possibly the greatest Roman of all time. The plan was for Brutus and his co-conspirators to seize control over the Roman state after Caesar's assassination. But this is not what happened, because Caesar was much loved by the common people, and even though Caesar himself was gone, his soldiers weren't. Brutus and Cassius Longinus had to flee from Italy and traveled to Macedonia, where they assembled tens of thousands of soldiers from the eastern provinces. In the meantime, Octavian and Mark Antony, who was Caesar's adopted son and second in command respectively, had seized power in Rome and controlled almost all Roman forces in the west. Octavian and Mark Antony swore to avenge Caesar, and thus began yet another civil war, no more than 2 years after the previous civil war had been concluded. Brutus and the so-called liberators indeed liberated Rome from Caesar's relative peace to another period of chaos and bloodshed. Octavian and Mark Antony confronted Brutus and Cassius Longinus at the Battle of Philippi, a battle which may have involved 200,000 men. Mark Antony stormed Cassius Longinus' camp, and Cassius proceeded to kill himself when the situation to him appeared hopeless. Brutus continued to fight during the days that followed, but suffered heavy losses and was forced to retreat. It was now clear that he could not win against Caesar's avengers, and Brutus knew that they would not be so merciful as Caesar once had been, after what Brutus had done to Caesar. Rather than letting himself be captured by Octavian and Mark Antony, Brutus decided to take his own life, just like Cassius Longinus. He did not ask for mercy, and instead fell on his own sword. Thus ever to traitors,